If you have ever worked yourself to the bone for someone who never once said thank you, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens to this single father will either break your heart or restore your faith in second chances. And if it moves you even a little, hit like and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard by more than just us. Daniel Cole had learned over the last 4 years that grief does not announce itself with thunder. It arrives quietly, in the space where a second cup of coffee used to sit on the counter, in the silence of a car that used to carry 2 voices instead of 1. His wife, Sarah, had died in a highway accident on a rainy October night, leaving him with a 6-year-old daughter named Lily and a mortgage he could barely keep pace with. 4 years later, Lily was 10, all elbows and freckles and a stubborn, luminous kind of optimism that Daniel privately believed she had inherited from her mother, because he certainly hadn't held on to much of his own. He worked as a senior systems engineer at Meridian Dynamics, a mid-sized technology firm that made industrial automation software for manufacturing plants across the country. He had been there for 9 years. He had built half of their flagship product from nothing, had rewritten the core scheduling engine twice, had personally flown to Ohio at 2 in the morning during a blackout to keep a client's assembly line from grinding to a halt. He did not consider himself a hero. He considered himself a father who needed a paycheck and, if he was honest with himself, a man who had quietly fallen in love with the discipline of solving problems, because it was the only place in his life where things could still be fixed. Sarah used to tease him about it, gently, in the years before the accident. "You talk to broken code the way other people talk to their therapists," she'd said once, watching him hunch over his laptop at midnight, chasing down a bug that had nothing to do with any deadline, simply because leaving it unsolved felt unbearable to him. He missed that voice more than he let himself admit, even to himself. Even 4 years later, he kept her reading glasses in the drawer of his nightstand, not because he expected to need them, but because throwing them away had felt, in the raw months after the funeral, like erasing one more small proof that she had existed. Lily didn't remember much about her mother directly. She had been 6. But she had inherited Sarah's habit of narrating her own thoughts out loud while she worked, and some nights, hearing his daughter mutter to herself over a math worksheet at the kitchen table, Daniel had to excuse himself to the bathroom for a minute before he could trust his voice again. Grief, in Daniel's experience, did not compete with exhaustion. It simply moved in alongside it and unpacked its bags. He learned to function inside both at once. He learned which of Lily's teachers responded fastest to email, which grocery store ran the best Tuesday markdowns on meat nearing its sell-by date, how to stretch a single rotisserie chicken across 3 dinners without either of them noticing they were eating the same thing again. None of it was glamorous. All of it was, in its own unremarkable way, a kind of engineering, optimizing a system with too few resources and too little slack, keeping it running not because anyone was watching, but because the alternative was unthinkable. His mornings were a choreography he had perfected out of necessity. 6 a.m. alarm. 6:15 wake Lily, lay out cereal, check her backpack for the permission slip she always forgot to mention until the last possible second. 6:45 walk her the 4 blocks to Mrs. Alvarez's house, who watched her until the school bus came, because before school care cost money Daniel didn't have. 7:15 catch the express bus downtown, because after Sarah died he'd sold their second car within a month, telling himself it made financial sense, never quite admitting that he could not stand to see it sitting in the driveway unused. He was, by every account of the people who worked beside him, a quietly exceptional employee. His teammates joked that Daniel was the only person in the building who could read a stack trace at 2 in the morning and still remember to text his babysitter to check whether Lily had finished her homework. Junior engineers routed their hardest bugs to him not because it was official policy, but because everyone quietly understood that Daniel didn't just fix problems. He explained them, patiently, in a way that made you smarter the next time instead of just grateful. He was also, by every account of the people who worked above him, invisible. That invisibility had a name, and her name was Vanessa Kessler. Vanessa had become CEO of Meridian Dynamics 18 months earlier, brought in by the board after a rocky merger to modernize the culture and sharpen accountability. What that meant, in practice, was a relentless focus on visible performance. Who spoke up in meetings, who took credit fastest, who golfed with the right vendors, over the invisible, unglamorous labor that actually kept the company's engines running. Daniel had never been good at self-promotion. He fixed things and went home to his daughter. In Vanessa's calculus, that made him a name she barely recognized on a spreadsheet, rather than the reason 3 of her biggest manufacturing clients hadn't walked out the door during the merger chaos. The annual bonus letters went out on a gray Tuesday in March, the kind of overcast morning that made the fluorescent lights of the office feel even colder than usual. Daniel had budgeted around his bonus the way he budgeted around everything, carefully, conservatively, with a specific and aching purpose. Lily had been accepted into a 2-week summer STEM immersion camp at the state university, the kind of program that could plant the first seed of a scholarship someday, the kind of program Sarah would have been thrilled about. Tuition, room, and board came to just under $4,000. Daniel's bonus, in the 2 prior years, had been enough to cover it with room to spare. He had already told Lily she was going. He had already watched her run through the kitchen, shrieking with joy, taping the acceptance letter to the refrigerator like it was a diploma. When he opened the envelope at his desk, his coffee going cold beside his keyboard, the number on the page made him read it 3 times, certain there had been a printing error. $412. He sat very still for a long moment, the fluorescent lights humming above him, and then he stood up and walked to Vanessa's corner office, because surely, this was a mistake that could be corrected with one conversation. Vanessa's office smelled faintly of expensive candles and printer toner. She did not stand when he entered. She gestured vaguely at the chair across from her desk without looking up from her monitor, and when she finally did look at him, her expression carried the particular blankness of someone who had genuinely forgotten his name and was doing rapid mental arithmetic to recover it from context. "Mr. Cole," she said finally, landing on it. "What can I do for you?" "I think there's an error in my bonus letter," Daniel said, sliding the paper across the desk. "It says $412. Last year I received a little over $4,000. Vanessa glanced at the number, without much interest. "That's not an error. We restructured the bonus formula this cycle to weight it more heavily toward client-facing revenue generation and leadership visibility. Engineering support roles were rebalanced downward across the board." "I saved the Ohio account during the blackout," Daniel said, keeping his voice level, though something hot and helpless was rising in his chest. "I rebuilt the scheduling engine that 3 of your top clients depend on every single day. I haven't missed a single deadline in 9 years. "And that work is valued," Vanessa said, in the tone of someone reciting a sentence she had used many times before, to many people, and had stopped hearing the meaning of. "But the board wants to see revenue-generating impact reflected more directly in compensation this year. I'd encourage you to think about ways to raise your visibility. Maybe take point on some client calls." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Lily's face taped to the refrigerator door. He thought about the blackout in Ohio, the exhaustion in his bones at 4 in the morning, the plant manager shaking his hand like he'd saved the man's job, which he had. He thought about 9 years of unglamorous, load-bearing work that had never once required a thank you to be worth doing. Until now, when the absence of one had a dollar amount attached to it that his daughter's summer depended on. "Understood," he said, because there was nothing else useful to say, and he left before his voice could betray him. He didn't go back to his desk right away. He walked down to the stairwell, sat on the cold concrete steps between the 3rd and 4th floors, and put his face in his hands for exactly 90 seconds, which was the amount of time he allowed himself, on principle, before he had to stand back up and be a person who had a daughter to pick up from Mrs. Alvarez's house at 5:30. Priya found him there 12 minutes later, on her way down for coffee, and sat beside him on the cold step without asking permission. She had worked 2 cubicles over from Daniel for 6 years, had watched him field 2 a.m. client emergencies with the same even tone he used to answer a colleague's simple question, and had, on more than one occasion, quietly covered a deadline for him during the worst weeks after Sarah died, without ever once mentioning it afterward. "Let me guess," Priya said. "The bonus." Daniel didn't answer, which was answer enough. $400, he finally said. 9 years, and they gave me $400 and a suggestion that I raise my visibility. Priya exhaled slowly through her nose, the particular exhale of someone recalculating exactly how much longer she intended to stay somewhere. "You know what's insane? Marcus in sales golfed with 2 vendors last quarter and got a $12,000 bonus for client relationship development. You kept the actual clients from leaving. There's not a person on this floor who doesn't know that." "Doesn't seem to matter what this floor knows," Daniel said. "It matters to somebody," Priya said, standing and offering him a hand up. "It just hasn't found you yet." He didn't think much of the comment at the time. He filed it away, the way he filed away most kindnesses lately, without quite believing he had room left to use it. He told himself, on the walk to the bus that evening, that he would find a way. He always found a way. He would take on freelance contract work in the evenings after Lily went to bed. He would sell the good camera Sarah had bought him for their 5th anniversary. He would figure it out, because figuring it out was the only skill he had ever really trusted himself to have. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, sitting on that bus with his forehead against the cold window glass, was that 3 weeks earlier, at a manufacturing technology conference in Chicago, a plant operations director from the Ohio client had mentioned his name, almost in passing, to a woman standing near the coffee station during a break between panels. "The whole line would have gone down for 2 days if it weren't for this one guy from Meridian," the director had said. "Daniel Cole. Flew out here himself at 2 in the morning. Didn't even bill us overtime, just fixed it and left. I've never seen customer service like that in this industry." The woman standing near the coffee station was Rachel Ibarra, founder and CEO of Halcyon Systems, Meridian Dynamics' fastest-growing competitor. Rachel had built Halcyon from a garage startup into a company now nipping seriously at Meridian's heels, and she had built it on a philosophy she talked about often and practiced rigorously. Find the people who do the real work, and take care of them before someone else notices they exist. She had written the name Daniel Cole in the Notes app on her phone that same afternoon, with a small flag next to it, the kind of flag she used for names she intended to remember. She had not moved on it right away. Poaching talent from a competitor without a real opening, a real conversation, and a real reason felt to her like theft rather than recruitment. But she had kept his name in the back of her mind the way you keep the number of a good contractor, not urgent, but valuable, filed away for the day it mattered. That day arrived 4 days after Daniel's meeting with Vanessa, in the most unglamorous way imaginable, through a mutual industry contact, a systems architect named Priya Nair, who worked alongside Daniel at Meridian and had, over lunch one gray Thursday, vented on his behalf to a friend at Halcyon about how the new CEO was gutting morale and running off the very engineers who kept the client relationships alive. "They cut Daniel Cole's bonus by 90%, Priya had said, stabbing at her salad with more force than the vegetables strictly required. Daniel Cole, the guy Sanderson Manufacturing specifically asks for by name. He's a single dad. He never complains. He just quietly saves everyone's projects, and they treat him like a line item they can trim." The friend mentioned it to a colleague. The colleague mentioned it to Rachel's chief of staff, And by the following Monday, Rachel Ibarra had pulled the flagged note back up on her phone and made a decision she had learned, over a decade of building Halcyon, never to second guess. When you find out that someone extraordinary is being treated as ordinary, you move before the world corrects its own mistake and someone else scoops them up first. Daniel, meanwhile, had spent that week the way he spent every difficult week, quietly, methodically, without letting Lily see the strain. He had picked up 2 freelance contracts in the evenings, staying up until 1 in the morning debugging code for a logistics startup in exchange for enough money to keep the STEM camp deposit from lapsing. He had not slept more than 5 hours a night in 8 days. He had also, almost without deciding to, started updating his resume. Not because he had a plan, but because some quiet, self-protective part of him had finally admitted that 9 years of loyalty had bought him $412 and a suggestion that he raise his visibility. He hadn't sent it anywhere yet. He was still telling himself he was just being prepared, the way he kept a spare tire in the trunk he hoped never to use. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the bonus letter, Daniel walked into Vanessa's office one more time. Not to plead, but to give notice. He had decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours of the previous night, that dignity was worth more than the severance he'd lose by waiting for a better offer that might never come. He would freelance full-time if he had to. He would figure it out. He always did. Vanessa did not seem surprised, which somehow stung more than anger would have. "I understand," she said, already half turned back to her monitor. "HR will process your exit paperwork. 2 weeks is standard, but given restructuring, we can let you go effective this Friday if that's easier for you." Effective this Friday. 2 days. 9 years dissolved into a scheduling convenience. Daniel walked back to his desk in a kind of fog, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead the way they had the day of the bonus letter, and began, mechanically, to box up 9 years of his life. A framed photo of Lily's first day of kindergarten, a chipped mug that said "World's Okayest Engineer" that Sarah had given him as a joke, a small potted succulent that had somehow survived his entire tenure through nothing but forgetful neglect and stubborn will. He was halfway through taping the box shut when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Is this Daniel Cole?" a woman's voice asked, warm but businesslike. "Speaking." "My name is Rachel Ibarra. I'm the CEO of Halcyon Systems." She let that land for a beat. "I know this is out of nowhere, and I know it's an unusual way to reach out, but I heard what happened over at Meridian this quarter, and I heard your name from someone at Sanderson Manufacturing months before that, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. I'd like 15 minutes of your time, today if possible, because I don't think a company like Meridian deserves to keep someone like you by accident." Daniel sat down slowly in his half-emptied chair, the tape gun still in his other hand. "I'm sorry. How did you even hear about this?" "Word travels in this industry faster than people think," Rachel said, "especially when good people get treated badly. I'm not asking you to trust me on faith. I'm asking for 15 minutes so I can make my case properly, and then you can tell me to lose your number if you want." He almost said no, out of sheer disbelief, out of the particular exhaustion of a man who had learned not to expect good news to be real. But something in her voice, direct, unhurried, entirely lacking the vague corporate blankness he'd grown so used to, made him say, 15 minutes. I have to be somewhere by 5:30. "I'll make it count," Rachel said. She made it count. She told him, without flattery, exactly what she knew about his work: the Ohio blackout, the scheduling engine rebuild, the client retention numbers that Meridian's own sales, team quietly credited to the reliability of their technical support, which was corporate, language for Daniel Cole showing up at 2 in the morning without complaint. She told him Halcyon was building out a new systems reliability division and needed someone to lead it from the ground up, not as a favor, not as charity, but because she had genuinely been looking for exactly this kind of engineer for 8 months and hadn't found the right one. She named a salary that was 40% higher than what he'd been making at Meridian, full remote, flexibility 3 days a week so he could be home when Lily got off the bus, and a signing bonus, she added almost as an afterthought, of $5,000, effective immediately upon signing. Enough, though she had no way of knowing this detail, to cover a STEM camp tuition and then some. "I don't say this to every candidate," Rachel said toward the end of the call, her voice softening slightly. "But I built this company because I got tired of watching talented people get treated like overhead instead of the reason a business survives. I don't need you to owe me anything for saying that. I just need you to know it's true before you decide." Daniel sat in the wreckage of his half-packed office, looking at the photo of Lily's first day of kindergarten still lying face up on his desk, and for the first time in 3 weeks, something in his chest loosened instead of tightening. "Send me the offer," he said. "I'll read it tonight." He read it 3 times that night, after Lily was asleep, at the same kitchen table where he'd once budgeted her camp tuition down to the dollar. It was real. It was generous. It was, more than the number on the page, an acknowledgement, the thing Vanessa Kessler had never once offered him in 9 years, that the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping things running was not invisible to everyone. He signed it the next morning and walked it, printed, into Vanessa's office before his official last day, less out of spite than a need for closure. "I wanted you to hear it from me directly," he said. "I've accepted a position at Halcyon Systems." For the first time in 18 months, Vanessa Kessler looked genuinely, entirely caught off guard. "Halcyon," she repeated slowly, as though testing whether the word might rearrange itself into something less alarming. "They're our closest competitor." "Shh. I'm aware," Daniel said. "Is this about the bonus? Because if it's a compensation issue, we can revisit." "It was never just about the bonus," Daniel said, and he found to his own quiet surprise that his voice didn't shake at all. "It was about being told for 9 years in 100 small ways that the work I did mattered, and then being told in one letter that it didn't. Rachel Ibarra offered me something you never did. She said thank you before she asked for anything." He didn't wait for a response. He picked up his box, the photo, the chipped mug, the stubborn little succulent, and walked out of Meridian Dynamics for the last time, into a gray Friday afternoon that felt, against every reasonable expectation, like the beginning of something rather than the end. His last afternoon at Meridian, a handful of co-workers he'd worked beside for years stopped by his half-empty desk to say goodbye, awkwardly, the way people do when they suspect a company doesn't deserve the person leaving it. Priya hugged him and told him she'd be putting in her own notice within the month, which turned out to be true. One of the junior engineers he'd mentored, a nervous 24-year-old named Oscar who still called him Sir, no matter how many times Daniel asked him not to, shook his hand and said quietly, "You made me better at this job than I thought I could be. I just wanted you to know that before you left." Daniel carried that sentence with him on the bus ride home more carefully than he carried the box of his belongings. The first 3 months at Halcyon were, by Daniel's own private accounting, the best working months of his career. Rachel gave him full ownership of the reliability division. Sat in on his first client call not to oversee him but to introduce him personally as the engineer who's going to make sure none of you ever lose a night's sleep over downtime again. His team, 4 engineers he handpicked himself, treated deadlines the way he always had, as promises rather than suggestions, and for the first time in years, Daniel found himself staying late not out of desperate necessity, but because the work itself felt like it belonged to him. He used part of the signing bonus for Lily's STEM camp, exactly as planned, and the rest he put into a small emergency fund he had never, in 9 years at Meridian, been able to build. When Lily came home from the 2-week program that summer, sunburned and glowing, clutching a certificate for Most Creative Robotics Design, She launched herself into his arms in the driveway and said, breathless, "Dad, I built a robot that can sort recycling by itself. I want to be an engineer like you." Daniel held her there a long moment, in the driveway of the house he could finally comfortably afford to keep, and thought about the $412 and the stairwell and the 90 seconds he'd allowed himself before standing back up. 6 months later, he heard through Priya, who had also since left Meridian for a firm with better values and better pay, that Sanderson Manufacturing had quietly moved a portion of their contract to Halcyon Systems, specifically requesting that Daniel Cole's team handle the transition. Meridian's quarterly numbers, apparently, had taken a hit that the board was not pleased about, and Vanessa Kessler's tenure as CEO had reportedly grown considerably more precarious in the months since. Daniel did not celebrate that news exactly. He had learned, through grief and hardship, that satisfaction built on someone else's downfall tended to curdle. But he did allow himself one small, private moment of vindication, standing in his kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold not from neglect this time, but because he'd gotten distracted helping Lily with a homework problem about gear ratios. What he told himself, and what he told Lily one evening when she asked why he'd left his old job, was simpler than any of it. Simpler than bonuses, or vindication, or the satisfaction of a rival's decline. "Sometimes," he said, tucking her blanket around her shoulders, "the people who are supposed to see your worth don't. And that doesn't mean you don't have worth. It just means you haven't found the right people yet. But you keep doing good work, and being kind, and showing up. And eventually, someone notices. Someone always notices." Lily considered this with the particular gravity of a 10-year-old processing something important. "Like Ms. Ibarra noticed you." "Like Ms. Ibarra noticed me," Daniel agreed. "I'm glad she called you," Lily said, already half asleep. "Me too, baby," Daniel said quietly, switching off the lamp. "Me too." There was one more moment, small and unplanned, that Daniel would return to in his mind more often than the signing bonus or the vindication of Sanderson's shifted contract. It happened at a regional manufacturing technology conference the following spring, the same kind of event where Rachel had first heard his name. Daniel was there representing Halcyon, standing near a coffee station between panels, when he spotted Vanessa Kessler across the room, still CEO of Meridian for the moment, looking smaller somehow than he remembered, or perhaps he had simply grown taller in the months since he'd stopped shrinking himself to fit inside her spreadsheets. Their eyes met briefly. She gave him a short, unreadable nod, the kind you give a person you once failed to see clearly and now cannot unsee. He nodded back without malice and turned to answer a question from a plant manager who had specifically sought him out to ask about Halcyon's reliability guarantees. He did not think about Vanessa again for the rest of the day. If there is one thing this story leaves behind, it is this: the quiet, unglamorous work you do when no one is watching is never actually invisible. Someone, somewhere, is always taking notice, and the right door tends to open at exactly the moment you've stopped waiting for it. If Daniel's story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more real stories of quiet strength, and share it with someone who needs to hear tonight that their hard work has not gone unnoticed.